Don't allow anybody to define you, or rather, trust who you allow to define what you do. An interpretation of a piano piece, even super famous, like a ballade by Chopin, to take an example. Because you want to fit the tradition, because you want to be accepted by your peers through juries, auditions, exams, competitions, auditions for jobs, and then eventually one day write articles about it, record it, make a statement which is yours on top of the statement of the piece itself. And the ingredients that you do, like seasoning in a salad, are up to the individual taste. For some, it's too much rubato, not enough accelerando, or the others, you involve too much yourself in the piece. The emotion is already in the piece, and you're just giving it while letting it happen on its own, and not adding your own, what it means to you. In a way, you can be only convincing if you're convinced, regardless if it's atonal music or post-tonal music, for instance, dodecaphonic music, which is officially more cerebral than emotional, but which has its beauty emotionally too. And therefore, it's an acquired taste. But very often, when we need to find a conviction in what we do, we need to hear what and therefore others tell us, don't have enough sound, you have too much sound, you play as a composer, you're not enough respectful of the text. There are so many assumptions that people do about it. For instance, play as a composer as if it's a plague. But not. It doesn't mean that you're less respectful, because you can think as a composer when you play the piano, interpreting a piece which by itself exists besides your interpretation, obviously. But you have to give it life during the performance, and therefore the dosages of the elements that you're going to enhance, bring out, or less, should be the fruit of your experience playing the piece, practicing the piece, recording the piece, until you bring a coherence to the meaning it has to you. And when you play it on the stage in front of audience, you go from A to Z into the piece through the path that you pre-designed in your practicing, because that's how you want the psychological storytelling narrative to be convincing, and therefore constructed around the values that the style and the genre that you play mean to you. And they don't mean the same way to a teacher, or to another teacher, or a third teacher. And they don't mean the same way to a competitor, or a colleague, or to somebody who gives you an advice without to be asked, or somebody whom you seek the advice from. And then we become more vulnerable when we're told things that we think we're not projecting, but we thought we did. And so then it's a question of, should I do more? Should I do less? Do I play too loud, too fast, too soft? Well, obviously, it's more subtle than these few parameters. But generally speaking, it is true that I observe that students need necessary dose of confidence in their own endeavor. Regardless if the piece is brand new and they have to imagine the interpretation of it to be convincing. And this way they're more convincing because people who receive it don't know it. But if people receive a piece that everybody has played in piano, then inevitably you have to go through the hurdle of the acceptance. Within which level of acceptance are you right, and in after which and around which, or outside of the box of which, are you eccentric and not expected to do this? Of course, the editions, the publishers, the musicologists, the scholars define a lot of this in the edition, but the edition doesn't speak the music. You do. You sing it, you speak it, you mention it, you observe why is this pattern this way, why the composer didn't do it that way. It doesn't mean that you question the status quo, but it's healthy to do so in the practicing process, like in a rehearsal with an orchestra. You can try different balances of instruments where the orchestration defines them by the choice of the composer's instrument. And then pianists is more shadow and light, or articulation, and different characteristics which bring the three-dimensional expression of the meaning of what you are saying through your notes, like meant syllables of an imaginary text that is psychologically embedded or hinted in the gestures of the intervals melodically. And so if you don't overwhelm it with pedal, you hear it clearly. And if it's under pedaled, then it's too dry. And you never practice in the concert hall because it's unavailable, or on a great instrument on which you could learn how to manage the ratio of effort versus projection. And some people are told you don't have enough sound. Some people are told you play too loud. Let less in chamber music or accompanying other instruments. But even solo pianists, compared to the piece's aesthetics. But the intimacy of a section in Chopin or in Beethoven doesn't have the same natural expression on stage in front of 2,000 people or 20 people. Or in general, you just play it for the purpose of what you idealize the music piece that you play is supposed to represent. So in fact, you're trying to reach your idealization, and you're afraid that by a non-reliable technique based on muscular memory, lack of repetition, which is boring and lonely compared to chamber musicians who practice together in merging their energies of intonation, vibrato, like in a quartet. And so they progress together towards the piece. In the piano, you progress alone, or you regress, or you feel like you're not even getting anywhere, because whatever you gained in the muscular memory doesn't hold the next day, and you feel like it's ephemeral. Everything is ephemeral. You build those incredible structure that you imagine in your mind before you start the piece to go to the end of it through the storytelling that you chose. And then the way the instrument responds, the acoustic, and because you practice in a room or a chamber or whatever it is, on the piano more or less responding, and you hear recordings where the sounds are extrovertedly enhanced with reverb and all kinds of things, that the sound sounds like some incredible resonance, and you feel like yours doesn't. So you end up by intuitively pushing more the keys to obtain more, but you only get more is not better, and louder is not but banked. Voiced is to choose what to bring out and what less, because the shadow and light. You don't have a clarinet, oboe, and a bassoon in the piano as a it's not a synthesizer, but it's an imaginary synthesizer, because you project your imagination and people catch the idea through the shadow and lights. It's almost like a color film watched in black and white, where the shadow and lights hint the depth of the colors or the lightness of the colors. So yes, many pieces for piano, Beethoven sonatas, are through the piano. The orchestral fragmentation of symphonic instrumentations with the brass, the strings, the woodwinds, the percussion, combination of, or little solos, or by groups. And they have the resonance and the pedal, which the orchestration doesn't have, but the acoustic of the whole. The pianists use the pedal because it's usually practiced in places where it's too dry. And so you feel like musically it's more rewarding to have more stuff, more butter, more salt, more oil in the cooking, or more sauce in the whatever. In other words, the right proportions according to the recipe when you prepare a meal for friends. Some people would say, could I have some more this or that, salt or something? And you can say, no, that's supposed to be like this. But we don't have the same palates, and we don't taste the same way the music. In analogy, the vibrato, the accelerando, for some is too much, for some is not enough. For those who don't involve themselves, then they try to stay, as I say, not involved in the piece that they serve. And then if you say, oh, but people told me, for instance, since I was a child, oh, you play because you're a composer, the piano, as if that lessers the importance of the respect for the detail of the score, because you think as a composer, regardless if you're a composer or not. And if you think as an interpreter, then you think you're more honest because you only do one thing at a time, which is play rightfully, honestly what is written. And that is the problem, because interpretation and honesty, it's white lies help a society a lot to function, and not necessarily in a manipulative way. It's more about behaving, just like polyphony is supposed to be an exchange of equals without interference of an accompaniment or a prevailing line. You could say the same about this analogy with the behaving and how we try to look better than we are, or richer than we are, or more seductive than we think we are, to seduce somebody or some person or some people, to belong to some people. And when people tell a pianist, like colleagues or friends or competitors or teachers, or contradict each other by what they ask of what they say, because you cannot continuously follow to be defined by the others, or rather choose whom you trust, who defines you. And if you define the interpretation by the modulation of the piece, the relative major choice of the composer for an expression of hope, like in the first ballade by Chopin, you don't have to also enhance it, but you could slightly enhance it with a dynamic range difference. And who defines the good and bad taste of over-involvement, under-involvement? Is it better to under-involve, or is it fatal to over-involve? And I think it's in the eye of the beholder, and because of repetitivity, solo practice, loneliness, doubting, comparison with others who play the piece, one always feels not enough this, not enough that, not enough technique, not enough velocity, not enough projection, not enough everything. But in fact, we have to build our own map of how we're going to navigate through the piece, and how the muscular approach will be for the tone, not projection through the piano only, but extraction from the keyboard, like a sculptor that takes the raw material and shapes it into something that becomes the work of art, which is already pre-shaped by the composer's notation, but not necessarily all the details of a grace note equal the other note, or the grace note being tighter than the other note. By essence, with composers, right, these little elements that are unmeasured rhythmically, they leave it to the performer. But because we have so many recordings of so many pieces that are very famous, people are tending to be very careful about not appearing to be outside of the tradition. And sometimes you think, after all, it means to me enough to play how it means to me. And if it means that the dynamic range, a diminuendo before a subito, instead of a merge in traffic transition, is what you feel like it's dramatically more meaningful, then why spend all this time practicing it if you're going to only try to please the expected norm through the edition, publishers, recordings, juries, teachers, exams, auditions? It should be also meaning to you while you play it. And I think that's when you have to find to which level you can enhance that individual approach to already universally expected performance style of a piece. And then not for the sake of originality, but for the sake of your conviction beyond honesty or dishonesty. As I said earlier, it's about how much you want to connect the words or separate the words or the sentences. In other words, it's a lot about eloquence and rhetoric. Even if it's all written in the score, it's still there is room for ways of saying it differently. And so within a certain margin, which is granted not very wide, the teacher feels responsible, like I do, to bring the individuality of the student's expression, as well as not appearing to be, for some, assuming it's arrogance if you don't play the dynamic written dynamically in that section, and the subito becomes gradual, then it has to have a meaning in the construction of the statement of the section you play. It's not just individually this and that for the sake of it. It's about how you construct the storytelling, the build-up of the excitement, or the delays through the suspensions, appoggiaturas, and whichever affects the composer uses. So in other words, there is a convincing way to be individually bringing what it means to you while being convincing that you know that you respect what you're playing, and you think of it as a piece, not only to make sure you recite it correctly, but beyond, having enough technique, security, and muscular memory, repetitivity that holds in to give you the basis on which you can breathe freely to let the unexpected happen during the performance as a welcoming and adapt to it. Because you can never play like you planned everything, micromanaging. It doesn't work. And if it does, it sounds also unnatural, even if aesthetically correct. So it's a reproduction of let's say, Chopin improvising, notating, and then now published piece that we play as if we are improvising it. But it's a make-believe, while we have to be believable during it. That we are navigating in its waters. We are in immersion with the musical expression that all these elements of piano technique are supposed to bring to the listener to feel about. Since Chopin, for instance, in ballades uses a poetic form, but in music without lyrics, it's by essence a transposition. Already a poem by itself, it's a transposition of thoughts through chosen words that have sound resonance and chosen meaning compared to the synonymous words that could have been chosen. Therefore, everything is a chosen that is happened before we arrive in the piece, and then the teacher makes sure to say, but if you do this, you're going to shock those, and if you do not enough of this, you're going to appear like you're cautious and you're not daring, but if you're over daring, you'll appear arrogant, and if you don't do the dynamic sublime subito piano, even if the piano resonance overlaps, Beethoven chose to do it. We have to, of course, compared to the instruments of the time, think today, but we are today, and we play music of yesterday on instruments of today. Of course, if we play on the instruments of the time or models of modeled instruments of the time, then we can reestablish the balances of the piano wide spectrum of ranges with individual straight strung strings instruments that they had, where each low, mid, and high range had its own characteristic in terms of character, personalities, and suggestive musical language. But with the modern pianos that have cross strings, that have more homogeneous resonance on all the ranges, plus the pedal is longer, not to mention the middle pedal that could enhance holding one while you still don't play dryly the other, instead of blurring it all, in order to maintain what the composer wrote before they had that middle pedal, because they knew they didn't. Or perhaps the decay happened earlier, therefore it was less blurry anyway. You have to make choices how to reestablish the right balance of nuances, of this infinite amount of nuancing between breathing and pedal overlapping and harmonization over melodization, and how the one doesn't cover the other. And if it's too dry, or if finger pedaled in sections and in portions with the foot pedal, then you have this kind of option to inhabit with your expression your individual expression, the texture that the composer gives us to serve. And these are forever to be, I would say, harvests appear years after the grains are planted. And then it travels within us emotionally, intellectually, with a certain level of maturity. We manage better some transitions than other times. But the spontaneity should remain the driver, not only the analyzer who should, let's say, shutter down the spontaneity. I find it very important to give solid grounds technically for the artist to express themselves, and then give them options about the expression levels of involvement according to what is their conviction. If they don't have, I help them build one. It's a longer process than just clone mine on theirs. And if they have one that is perhaps, in my opinion, going to be considered by colleagues and peers who will judge and hear them for screenings and auditions and whatever, to make sure that they don't appear to be overly opinionated, nor completely without opinion. It's very important to find that middle ground, that being convinced is convincing, but all overall it's an evolving field, because you rediscover the piece every time you play it, every time you revisit it after years of having played it, and you feel like you sink in at different levels of emotional and intellectual harvest of all these ideas that come to fruition in a very driven concept of beginning to end. You know what you want to do and you do it. And if technique doesn't betray you, then you feel like you've accomplished that. And then you try to think, how else can I tell it next time? How else can I mean it for this or that aspect that I didn't do as I wished I could? I didn't know how to approach it. I didn't know how much I should enhance it, because then it loses the structural organization. Or if it's too much rubato, change tempi, noise, or unity of tempo, unity of brace, especially the pulse. Then you can rethink the status quo, and as a teacher, as a performer, as a scholar, or in the publisher of a recording or of a score, with your rooted in your conviction through years of experience of the piece, conviction. I find it to be a fascinating overall story, but the most important is at all levels, from the get-go, when you start the piece, don't let others define you. Try to define yourself and trust who helps you define it. Thank you.